We should be recording, and we should be up on Facebook Live as well. All right, sweet. We'll give everybody a couple minutes to hop on, start watching all that good stuff. Sweet. All right, got our first one, Miss Cindy, first one in. Zane, the MacBook came in today, so you'll be able to have your laptop back.
Good. Having to support the preacher, man.
Right. Your sacrifice has been noted. And looks like we're up to 3. All right. We're going to go, I don't know how many we're going to actually end up having. So I got a little bit late on sending out the notifications. So we'll see. We'll see. All right. So we got a chance to talk last week about Jonah. And so Jonah kind of serves as a template for us on Messianic Prophecies. Really, he's only got the one, and then he's got a kind of an allusion as well. But what we're going to start seeing is as we go through the prophets, we're going to start seeing more and more ideas developed. And what's going to be really cool is we're actually going to see several of these ideas then referenced by later prophets and built upon by them. And so Amos is really going to start kind of serving as the bedrock of that. Amos is the first one chronologically, and you're going to see several of the other Israel prophets, particularly Isaiah, is going to build off of Amos's Day of the Lord theme. And then you're going to see the prophets in Judah are going to build off of what's going on in Israel as well. So it's kind of a gradual progression of these various Messianic prophecies. And so we're going to see a lot of repetition, but also a lot of expansion as well. And so Amos kind of serves as a good introduction really to the prophets in general, but especially to the ideas of David, of Jesus being the successor of David. And so the first one that we're going to look at tonight, if you want to go ahead and turn over to the book of Amos, we're going to look at Amos chapter 7. And so for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, we're looking through, as part of our curriculum for this whole year, we've been going through the entire Bible, and we have been looking at the Bible as a big picture and trying to get more of an idea of the entire story of the Bible. So we've been going through a lot of the Old Testament. We've gotten through the book of Kings. We've gotten through the kingdom, and we've gotten through the fall of Israel. And so now we're going to take a look at the prophets, starting with the prophets that went to Israel, specifically Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah. But we're also going to take some time on these Wednesday nights class to specifically look at the Messianic prophecies of the Old Testament prophets. We're going to see how these prophets become really kind of the cornerstone figures for the New Testament authors to explain what's going on in the life of Jesus. And so the first one we're looking at is Amos tonight. And Amos is really cool because Amos is a very odd prophet. In fact, many would question in his day whether he was a prophet at all. He had no classical education. He wasn't a son of a prophet, as we've seen in the book of Kings. Instead, he's just a sheep herder and a tender of figs. And so he's called out of this very obscure position and is given this pretty intense task to go and proclaim God's day of judgment, not only upon Israel, but upon the nations around Israel as well. And so he's a pretty cool character in and of himself because he's really this nobody that has no great credentials, that has no high position in the temple, but he's just called on as an average guy to go and deliver this message for the Lord. And so that's actually what we're going to look at first. The first several chapters are his prophecies and some of the judgments in particular against the nation. But then in chapter 7, we actually get one of the few prose pieces of this prophet, and we actually see him in conflict with some of the religious elite of his day. And so we're going to start. Zach, if I could get you to read Amos chapter 7, verse 10 through 17.
Then Amaziah the priest of Bethel sent to Jeroboam, king of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the midst of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all of his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. What verse?
Through 17.
And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, and eat bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel. For it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom. Then Amos answered and said to Amaziah, I was no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go, prophesy to my people Israel. Now therefore hear the word of the Lord. You say, Do not prophesy against Israel, and do not preach against the house of Isaac. Therefore, thus says the Lord, your wife shall be a prostitute in the city, and your sons and your daughters shall fall by the sword, and your land shall be divided up with a measuring line. You yourself shall die in an unclean land, and Israel shall surely go into exile away from its land.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so we see Amos pretty quickly comes into conflict with the city of Bethel. And so the city of Bethel, as we recall from reading through the book of Kings, that was one of the big religious centers of the kingdom of Israel. That was where Jeroboam had set up one of the golden calves, and that was where he had set up this big temple in direct opposition to Solomon's temple. And so hundreds of years later, we're now in the reign of Jeroboam II, we're several generations later, and Amos has come to prophesy against Bethel, against Israel, and saying that their idolatry is leading them to destruction, that if they don't repent, this day of the Lord, this judgment is coming upon them. And so he's opposed by this priest of Bethel, kind of the Israel parallel of a high priest of Judah. And he basically says, you need to stop prophesying here. You're a false prophet. You're not welcome here. How does this treatment of Amos by Amaziah, how do we see some parallels with that, with the life of Jesus?
Well, Jesus wasn't accepted by his own people. They didn't listen to his words or believe what he said about the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is going to be one of the things that we're going to see really consistently occur in the prophets. We didn't really see it in Jonah so much because he's kind of an atypical one. But by and large, Israel and Judah rejects the prophets almost wholeheartedly. And so Amos is kind of setting the tone here that the religious leaders, by and large, are going to completely ignore them. We're going to see a lot of the kings of Israel and Judah are going to reject the prophets. We've already seen in the book of Kings, Ahab had hundreds of prophets of the Lord that would prophesy for him, but they weren't real prophets. They essentially had yes men and sycophants around them. And so real prophets of the Lord tend to face rejection more than they do acceptance. And we see that really paralleled in the life of Jesus, that Jesus is rejected by most of the people of Israel, and especially the religious leadership. We see him in almost constant opposition to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the lawyers. There's a constant friction between those two groups. And consistently, you also see a lot of the same kind of accusations. Amaziah is accusing Amos of essentially just, trying to get his own bread. He's trying to get paid for it, assigning these very carnal motives. And you see the Pharisees do the same thing with Jesus. They say that he's got a demon within him, or he's trying to lead a rebellion against Rome. And so you see consistently the true prophets of God, by and large, are rejected by those who have rejected the Lord. And so that, in that sense, Jesus is going to be a direct descendant of a lot of the experiences of the prophets. We're going to see, like I said, Amos's experience is by no means unique here. Other thoughts and comments on this kind of parallel in terms of treatment of the prophets? And also, just as a note, those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, again, can still see comments and everything. So if you got questions, you have added comments, definitely feel free to add those. We'll make sure we get those in the discussion as well. All right.
Well, I mean, Matthew 23, you see the woes to the scribes and Pharisees, which, Amos is definitely speaking against the religious authorities. And then the parable of the tenants in Matthew 21, speaking of the poor treatment of and killing of the prophets, and then paralleling that to the Son being Jesus himself. So even Jesus in parables was drawing that comparison that you're drawing today.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the big things that Amos is prophesying about. He's going to prophesy a lot about the surrounding nations and about, the Edomites and Moabites and the Ammonites and all these wicked people. But he's then really going to turn it inward and say Israel is just as corrupt. Judah is just as corrupt as these people. And he's actually going to target the leadership and the wealthy and those who have begun to oppress the poor. He's going to say, you're the problem. You're the ones that are perverting God's justice. You're the ones who are destroying the very fabric of society by your selfishness, by your idolatry, by your wicked behavior. And so Amos is definitely, to use the modern parlance, he's speaking truth to power. And he is letting those who are in authority know, like, you're not immune from God's judgment because you're wealthy, because you're the religious leadership. God's day of judgment is going to come upon you, and it's going to come even harder upon you because of your arrogance. And that's very similar to what Jesus prophesies about Jerusalem and about the religious leadership and the wealthy of those days. His prophetic oracles against the city of Jerusalem are very harsh towards those who have abused their power. And again, the woes against the Pharisees and scribes, very similar situations there. And that actually kind of leads into the next passage that we want to talk about. If you turn over just a chapter over to Amos chapter 8, we actually see kind of a similar, kind of a summary of what we were just talking about, kind of the frustrations that Amos has that he's informing Israel of, and particularly this is what God is getting frustrated with Israel. And so in Amos chapter 8, in verse 5 through 6, Zane, could I get you to read Amos 8, 5 through 6?
Saying, when the new moon will be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we may offer wheat for sale, that we may make the ephah small and the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the chaff of the wheat.
Yeah, so we've got Amos pretty blatantly telling Israel that you're going through these motions of religious activity. You're going through the Sabbath, you're going through these new moon festivals, but there's huge problems with their heart because they're using these opportunities, and really they're just going through the motions on these, waiting for the next time they can make money, waiting for the next time that they can start to oppress the poor again, that they can take advantage of those lessers. And what maybe there's a clear parallel here. What does this make you guys think of as far as Jesus's life here? Maybe a similar time that he prophetically had issue with people doing such things.
Cleansing of the temple, maybe.
That's kind of where my thought goes to as well, is the cleansing of the temple. You see very similar situation where the Israel in Jesus's day, they distilled these festivals and the Sabbath and all these holy occasions. They distilled them down into a place to make money, and they're trying to get the most profit they can out of these things. And they've taken the holy and they've made it carnal. And so we see in many ways Jesus is kind of paralleling Amos's message here, that the important part of these festivals and of the Sabbath and of these celebrations was not just a routine observation of them. The importance of it was the true heart of the worshiper. And so just as Amos is condemning Israel for their failure to be genuine in this, Jesus is going to condemn Israel of his day in the same capacity. And so we see there's a lot of similarity in their messages here. And then in the same capacity, if you go down just to the next verse in chapter 7, or excuse me, in chapter 8 and verse 7, you see Amos says, "The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob. Indeed, I will never forget any of their deeds. Because of this will not the land quake, and everyone who dwells in it mourn. Indeed, all of it will rise up like the Nile, and it will be tossed about the subside like the Nile of Egypt. It will come about in that day, declares the Lord God, that I will make the sun go down at noon and make the earth dark in broad daylight. Then I will turn your festivals into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. and I will bring sackcloth on everyone's loins and baldness on every head. And I will make it like a time of mourning for an only son, and the end of it will be like a bitter day. So in the context, what day is Amos prophesying here? What is he foreshadowing is going to occur?
Day of judgment when Assyria comes and conquers them.
Yeah, so in context, he's talking about this coming day of the Lord, this day of judgment, and he's specifically talking about the collapse of Samaria, the fall of Israel to Assyrian captivity. It's going to be a day of great destruction. It's going to be a day of judgment. There's mourning. There's terrible nature of this. But what's interesting is that if you turn over to Matthew chapter 27, we're going to see a parallel here. Lowell, could I get you to read Matthew 27, verse 45 through 46?
Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?
All right, so now we see very similar language where Matthew is recording for us that as Jesus is being crucified, in the middle of the day, it turns dark as night. And that's exactly what Amos is prophesying here in verse 9 of chapter 8. He says, it will come about in that day, declares the Lord God, that I will make the sun go down at noon and make the earth dark in broad daylight. So which is it? Is Amos prophesying the fall of Israel in the day of judgment, or is he prophesying about the coming of Christ?
Both.
Both. And that's one of the really cool things about Old Testament prophecy is that there's often multiple fulfillments of it. And so if we were to answer that question, we'd say, well, we think it's about this, or we think it's about that. A lot of times there's going to be multiple fulfillments of these things. A lot of times that was very intentional, that you're going to have kind of a near future fulfillment, which in this case would be the destruction of Israel, but it's also going to be pointing forward to a more ultimate fulfillment of God's judgment. And so not only could we say that this is pointing forward towards the death of Christ, but even further, we can look at this kind of apocalyptic language as the final coming of Christ as well. And so many times it's pointing not just towards a New Testament fulfillment, but kind of a final fulfillment as well. And so that's one of the cool things, but also sometimes the challenging things about reading the prophets is that a lot of times they're using language that's going to be picked up later on to apply in multiple capacities. And so that's one of the cool things, but also one of the challenges of interpretation with this is you kind of have to be able to read this not just in its own context, but also how does the New Testament pick up on this language and utilize this language in future cases. And so, and that's one of the things that we really see here is that Amos himself wouldn't have really known exactly how his prophecies are going to be used. If you had asked Amos, what are you talking about? Amos probably would have said, this is the coming day of the Lord. This is the judgment on Israel. But you're going to see the later authors, also inspired by the New Testament, are going to be the ones who kind of fill in these gaps for us and show us how these prophets were prophesying really beyond themselves. And so that's one of the, I think one of the cool things about the Old Testament prophets is that in many ways they weren't aware of the full extent to which they were speaking. They couldn't have fully understood what God was telling them to say to Israel. But we're going to see in a lot of ways, the prophets exhibit enormous faith and also enormous humility in being willing to say, I may not understand exactly what my role in this is, but I'm going to do what God has told me to do. I'm going to have faith that he's going to work through all of this. And Amos is one example of that, but we're going to see there's a lot of very weird instances in the prophets. Hosea's marriage to Gomer, Isaiah and Ezekiel are going to do some very weird things in their prophetic journeys. We're going to see the prophets really stand up as instances of great faith and willingness to trust in God when it might not make full sense to themselves. Any thoughts or comments on what we're looking at here in chapter 8 and some of the connections to the New Testament?
Also, we see that, God allowed the crucifixion to occur, even though Jesus is crying out to him. I'm sure the Israelites cried out in the day of their captivity that, God, aren't you going to deliver us? But he didn't deliver them, of course.
Yeah, and that's one of the complexities of the day of the Lord, and that's something that Amos is about to pick up in chapter 9. But all the prophets kind of have this tension with the day of the Lord in the sense that the judgment is righteous, that the justice that God is bringing is deserved. Israel and Judah have sinned. There's no debating that. The prophets are very clear and they're very specific in the ways that God's people are sinning and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so there is a sense that this is just, this is right to occur. But there's also this narrative tension of, we know that there's promises made that Israel is supposed to bless the entire world, that Israel is supposed to be the vehicle with the Davidic promise. And so how is God going to enact his justice on these people for being sinners, but also hold up his promises to bless the whole world through them? And so there is that kind of question throughout the biblical narrative of, what's going to happen with this? How is God going to work through these things? And that's one of the things that Amos is going to pick up in chapter 9, is this idea of the remnant. That's one of the most important ideas in the prophets, is the idea that God is going to bring justice upon the nations, but he's also showing mercy upon the nation as well. That ultimately, even in the midst of this terrible justice, there's still going to be this continuity that's going to be the vehicle for God's promises that have stretched back all the way to Eden, to Abraham, to Mount Sinai. There's still this continuity throughout the biblical narrative that all of this is going to be taking place. And so that's one of the things that you see, is that the prophets kind of wrestle with these different things. We're going to see sometimes that's some of the prophetic oracles, is this them kind of questioning, God, how is this going to work? How are you using wicked nations to make this happen? How are you going to save Israel when they seem so corrupt? And there's going to be many times that even the prophets, though they have more vision than others, they're still going to be questioning and they're still going to be asking, what exactly is going on with all of this? And so I think we as readers are also meant to ask those questions as we're going through this, especially if we're looking at the whole story. We're kind of meant to feel a little bit of that tension as readers as well. So I think that's a great point to bring out there. Other thoughts or comments on what we're seeing here in chapter 8?
I was just thinking, sorry.
We're gonna get
I
some
was just
others
thinking
like
about,
that.
yeah, I was just thinking about, the comments that Amos made in verse 9 and 10 about the sun going down. I mean, I wonder how many of the people that saw the crucifixion actually thought back to, oh yeah, that's what Amos was talking about, or Amos talked about, or because like in Matthew 27, when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, that was a very familiar psalm to the Israelites. It went back to Psalm 22. So I would think that would have triggered something in their mind too at that point.
Yeah, and that's going to be one of the things that as we start getting into the New Testament, that's what we're going to start to get glimpses of, is how did Israel in the first century interpret these passages? How did they see these things coming about? And so one of the examples, I actually just wrote an article on this, they had a very clear idea that Elijah himself, like the physical man Elijah, was going to come back from the dead. And that was going to be this sign that the prophet Malachi, had specifically prophesied, is that Elijah's going to come and that's going to be the sign that the Messiah is here. And so they had read that as a physical reincarnation of Elijah. And so when John the Baptist came, everybody was kind of confused. They're like, wait, are you actually Elijah? That's why they even asked Jesus that several times. People are like, are you Elijah? And so we see that while the Israelites did possess these prophecies, in many ways they weren't quite sure what to make of them. They would know this has something to do with the Messiah. This has something to do with God's plan, but we're not exactly sure of what it's supposed to mean. And so with a passage like this, where it may or may not have been clear, I'd be curious how many Israelites actually put the pieces together and they're like, oh, this is how it is. It's funny because when we read the account of the crucifixion, the only one who seems to put it together is actually the Roman centurion. Is the only one who goes like, wow, this was the Son of God. And so you do get this sense really through all four of the Gospels that Israel really has not put the pieces together, that even the Pharisees and the Sadducees that should have known, and even the apostles who were right there watching all of this, neither group is really fully aware of what's going on with Jesus. And so it is one of the interesting things that we'll trace through in the New Testament of exactly how much does Israel know about what's going on here? So that's a great comment to bring up. And then Tracy, I think you had a question or a thought.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you were talking about the sun going down at noon and darkening the earth in broad daylight, a lot of times Amos may not have known where that was going, but that to me confirms the beauty of Scripture that God always does. God knew where it was going. God knew where it would wind up. And Amos may not, but the mind behind it all does. And God was looking to the day when Jesus was crucified, looking to that sign that he would use, a sign that the ancient world would understand as something momentous just happened. We take solar eclipses for granted so we can predict them. They could predict them, but saw them as massive acts of the displeasure of the gods of the universe. Yeah. And so, a solar eclipse was a big thing, and God uses that and sees that even at the Amos where he's going to go with that in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that's a really cool thing to actually trace through, especially the Old Testament, is when the sun and the moon and the stars don't do what they're supposed to be doing, that always heralds something big. That's always a really big deal. Like you said, we've got the scientific ability to track these types of things. They didn't have that ability, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And so all they would know is that if this occurred, that was a big oracle. That was a clear sign that something big was going to occur. But I think it is telling that one of the big criticisms of the Bible, one of the ways that people are seeking to discredit the Bible, one of the things they try to do is they try to kind of strip prophecy out of its context and try to make it that, well, if we assume there's no miracles that can take place, if we assume no one can tell the future like this, then we can kind of clearly dismiss some of these prophecies. And you can see some of that take place in books like Daniel. They'll claim that Daniel was written after all of these events had taken place, so that was how they knew everything would happen. But something like this, something like Amos 8, 9 through 10, there's no way that Amos could have ever known that would take place. We know that Amos is written far before the events of Christ, and yet this exactly occurs. And so it does really show the power of God. It shows the inspiration of God at work, that there's no way a man could have known this. There's no way that mortal people could have predicted these things with that type of accuracy. And so it is a huge part of the evidence for who God is and the veracity of the Scriptures, is that we're going to see throughout the prophetic picture, there's so many things that are predicted. There's no way all of it just randomly happened. There's no conceivable odds that would occur that some guy would just happen to be born and all of this would take place perfectly in line with the prophets. It's one of the clearest signs that God's at work in all of this. That's an excellent point to make there. Other thoughts or comments on anything in this before we get into Amos chapter 9? All right, so this is probably the biggest and probably the most obvious one that's going to be predicting Jesus is going to be related to Jesus. It's going to be Amos chapter 9 in verse 11 through 15. And so Amos is going to give one last oracle of judgment. He's going to give one last really description of this day of the Lord, of this coming judgment upon Israel. And it is a terrible judgment. It is a judgment that's going to result in the utter destruction of Israel. They're going to be scattered to the winds. Terrible things are going to take place. But then, almost abruptly, I mean, surprisingly so, Amos shifts gears entirely. And so in Amos chapter 9 and verse 11, and just to give you kind of some of the context, we're actually going to start in verse 8. He says, "Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are on the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth. Nevertheless, I will not totally destroy the house of Jacob, declares the Lord. For behold, I am commanding, and I will shake the house of Israel amongst all nations, as grain is shaken in a sieve, but not a kernel will fall to the ground. All the sinners of my people will die by the sword, those who say the calamity will not overtake or confront us. In that day, I will raise up the fallen booth of David and wall up its breaches. I will also raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are declared by my name, declares the Lord who does this. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman will overtake the reaper and the treader of grapes him who sows seed, when the mountains will drip sweet wine and all the hills will be dissolved. Also, I will restore the captivity of my people Israel. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will also plant vineyards and drink their wine, and make gardens and eat their fruit. I will also plant them on their land, and they will not again be rooted up from their land, which I have given them, says the Lord your God." And so we see this final oracle of Amos. This is the idea of the remnant. This is kind of that small glimmer of hope in the prophetic message. And almost every prophet has one of these. He has these oracles of all of this is going to take place, but there's also still hope for Israel. There's still hope for God's people. God is not lax concerning his promises. And the promises made to Adam, to Abraham, to Israel, to Moses, to all these people, to David, those promises are not going to fail, and God is still going to be faithful to his people. And so we see in this several, I think, kind of clear indications and clear allusions to what's going to take place with Jesus. So in particular, in verse 11, he says, "In that day I will raise up the fallen booth of David." Does anybody else have a different translation for that word there, booth?
Tabernacle?
Yeah, tabernacle. So it's very curious that Amos would use the word tabernacle here, because what's already in Jerusalem at this point in time of history?
The temple.
The temple. So if the temple already exists, and that's where God's presence is, and that's already the center of Israel religious activities, why would Amos talk about the tabernacle being restored? Well, does anybody happen to remember, what does the word tabernacle directly translate to? I see Al throws in the idea of the word shelter. So this tabernacle, this shelter, there's a word here that's at the root of the idea of tabernacle. Anybody happen to know what the translation there is?
Dwelling place?
Yeah, the idea of dwelling. And so that dwelling, that's one of the key concepts in the whole Old Testament, is the idea of God coming down and dwelling with his people. That was the whole picture of the tabernacle that we saw in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, is that they're building this place so that God can come off the mountain and he can dwell in the midst of them. Well, with that idea of Amos saying that I'm going to raise up the fallen dwelling place of David, then keep that in mind when you turn over to the book of John. In the very first chapter, in John chapter 1 and verse 14, when John is describing the coming of Jesus, the son of David, he says in verse 14 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory. Glory is of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so you might have a footnote there. What's the other way to translate that word dwelt among us?
Tabernacle.
Tabernacle. So what John is literally writing in the Greek is that the Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. And so that's one of the big ideas of Jesus, is that he is the fulfillment of all of this Old Testament imagery of Eden, of the tabernacle, of the temple. He is God amongst us. That's why that name Emmanuel is so important in the Gospel of Matthew, is that Jesus is the fulfillment of God coming down and dwelling with his people. And so we see that when Amos uses that language in chapter 9 and verse 11, that I'm going to restore the fallen tabernacle of David, he's directly alluding to what's going to occur with Jesus, that he's going to be the dwelling place of David restored. He's going to be God dwelling amongst his people. And so, again, there's no way Amos knows that's what he's saying. He doesn't understand that. But that's what God is already alluding to at this early stage in the prophetic message, is that there is going to be a new dwelling place. The temple is going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed several different times. The tabernacle at this point in time has already been lost. But that doesn't change what God is going to do with his people. That dwelling idea of God and man reuniting and dwelling together in Eden, that lineage, that idea still continues all the way through to the New Testament. And so we see several of these ideas of kind of reconstruction built up here. He talks about building up the wall from its breaches, raising up the ruins. He talks about restoring the captivity of my people Israel. So where do we see this fulfilled in the biblical story, what Amos is prophesying here?
During his resurrection.
Yes, and obviously there's multiple answers to this because we're talking about the idea of multiple fulfillments. And so from a New Testament perspective, this is Jesus's resurrection. This is the idea of that tabernacle of David, the dwelling place, being rebuilt, being raised again, the breaches being sealed, the captivity being restored. That's all talking about the idea of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, where else are we going to see this idea brought forth?
Revelation.
Yeah, we also see this language used in Revelation. We see the idea of the new city of God, of New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, this kind of final imagery of the city of God. We know that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed not only here, but Jerusalem's also going to be destroyed in 70 AD, that the city of Israel is going to be completely destroyed by the Romans. And so this spiritual Israel, though, that's what's going to be rebuilt in the day to come. We're also going to see this in an Old Testament fulfillment. Where do we see this restoration happen in the Old Testament?
When they enter the land of Canaan.
Yeah, so we actually, if you want to look back, it could be a reference to the idea of the initial conquest of land, of the initial bringing of Israel out of the ruins of slavery, out of the captivity of Egypt, and then coming into this land. And so certainly it's kind of looking back towards that language. Where's it looking forward to in the biblical story after this?
I feel a little confused because I want to say the rebuilding of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem isn't destroyed with Israel, it's destroyed with Judah and Babylon, and so the context seems wrong for that because this is the destruction of Israel, right? Not Judah. So
right, and so that's one of the things that we're going to see, and that's kind of that idea of the building of the message, is that we're going to see is that Israel's not rebuilt. Is that Samaria is never built again. We don't see the idea of these northern tribes of Israel coming back. And so he's not talking about the restoration of the northern kingdom of Israel. That was a wicked kingdom that was not worth saving. Judah's not much better, but Judah's the location of these promises. That's why we're going to see some of the later Judean prophets, guys like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zephaniah. These guys are actually going to take some of this idea of what Isaiah and his Israel compatriots are talking about, and they're actually going to apply it and say, this wasn't talking about Israel. This wasn't talking about Samaria. This was actually talking about this later destruction. And so the restoration's not going to be of Israel. It's not going to be an Assyrian restoration. It's going to be a Babylonian restoration. And so Amos, again, probably in his mind, is thinking more of the idea of the restoration of Israel. The Judean prophets are going to pick up this language and say, actually, this remnant is going to be the remnant that returns from Babylon. It's going to be returning from Cyrus in the days of Persia, and they're going to be the ones to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the city of God. And so that's kind of the Old Testament fulfillment of this, is this idea of ultimately the restoration of God's chosen city. Because Bethel, which is kind of the city that Amos is prophesying about, was never supposed to be a religious center. That was never supposed to be one of the cities of God. The only temple there was the temple to the golden calf. And so that was never going to be rebuilt. There was no value in that place. And so that's why we see that language kind of picked up by the Judean prophets there. But so we see this idea of multiple fulfillments here. We see it in the restoration of Israel in the Old Testament. We see it in the resurrection of Jesus. I would argue we also see it, I think this is talking in some ways about the church age. This is talking about the building of God's people being the church, being what occurs in the book of Acts. And we're seeing some of these ideas of the blessings that come with the restoration. We see descriptions of bounty. We see descriptions of fruitfulness, the idea of the plowman will overtake the reaper, the treader of grapes, the mountains dripping with sweet wine, the hills are flattened out. And we also see the idea of all of the nations being restored to Israel. It's what he says in verse 12, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by name. This is picking up that promise made to Abraham that all the nations would be blessed under Israel. And even in the height of Solomon's conquest, he still only controlled a fairly small area of the world. And so what we're going to see is that this particular idea of all the nations being under Israel, that never takes place in a physical sense. But if we see in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, we see a fulfillment of this idea, of the idea of all the nations of the earth coming to Jerusalem and being blessed there. And so, Tracy, if you want to read Acts chapter 2, verse 7 through 11.
And they were amazed and astonished, saying, Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents in Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God.
Yeah, so we see this language used that indicates basically everybody. I mean, this is describing pretty much every known language group in this time period, and they've all come to Jerusalem. They're there for these Passover feasts. They're there for these Jewish festivals. But now all of this big group of people, they're going to be the first members of God's kingdom. They're going to be the ones that are first blessed by God. This is the multitude that's going to be baptized, the 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. This is the start of God's kingdom. And so this is how we start to see this fulfillment of all nations brought to Israel and blessed there together. Now, again, the ultimate fulfillment of that is going to be in the final coming of Christ, when all of these nations in totality will come and all will be under the reign of Jesus. And so this kind of gives us an idea and an introduction into how these prophetic messages, it's not a clean one-to-one ratio. It's not a clean, this is what they prophesied and this is where we can point to it being fulfilled. This prophetic language is going to be used in a lot of different places and in a lot of different fulfillments, both sometimes in the immediate future of the Old Testament and also throughout the New Testament, in the times of Jesus, in the times of the early church, in times of the epistles, and even later, pointing forward to the end times and these apocalyptic eras, we're going to see these prophetic languages fulfilled. So thoughts and comments on anything we're seeing here in Amos and some of the connections between that and the New Testament?
Yeah, I think it's chock full of Eden imagery. I mean, it says, "I will plant." Well, God planted the garden. He's going to replant a new garden, and it's carried all the way through. Like you said, it's a reaffirming that there is going to be a reconnection between us and God, and heaven and earth will be joined once again, like it originally was.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Amos doesn't delve super deep into this idea of restoring the land of God, but you do see kind of some allusions here of the idea of the hills being flattened out, of this image of agricultural bounty, of a lot of produce and a lot of successful harvest. One of the things that the prophets are going to pick up is that the judgment that's coming on Israel is not just about punishment for their sins. It's also about the idea of restoration and renewal of the physical creation. And we're going to see several of the prophets are really going to delve into that idea. Some of them are even going to explicitly connect Israel's exile and the length of, or well, Judah's exile and the length of 70 years being the 70 Sabbath years that they had failed to observe. And so the prophets are going to be very concerned, not just with the nation of Israel and the people, they're also going to be concerned with the physical creation. And that's one of the things that I think we have probably not spend as much time on as kind of like a big collective group of Christians. That's one of the things that I think is sometimes missed in the prophetic image. But Paul makes it really clear, especially in Romans chapter 8, when he's talking about all of creation groaning under the curse of sin. He's picking up prophetic language there. He's picking up some of the ideas of prophets like Amos, where the physical creation has suffered because of sin. And so when God comes with this cleansing fire, and when he comes with this judgment of destruction, it's a destruction that's ultimately meant to purify. It's ultimately not annihilation, but a renewal, of removing the dross and the waste and the filth of sin, and leaving behind this beautiful remnant, this beautiful new creation that, like Zach points out, is very similar to an Eden type language. And so we're going to see that is only going to intensify as we continue to see more of the prophets building up this idea. But yeah, that idea of the tabernacle, of the dwelling of God, of Eden, of heaven and earth being reunited. All of those are really big prophetic ideals that are going to keep on being intensified as we go through the prophetic messages. It's a good point to bring up there. Other thoughts or comments? All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for good study on the book of Amos. And so we're going to continue getting into some of this. And so I believe next week we are looking at, I believe it's Hosea and Micah. And so going to be looking at some of these, the other two Israel prophets that are going to be same time period. All of these guys are kind of right around the time period of Jeroboam II. It's a time where Israel is really prosperous. And so they're going to have a lot to say in terms of the morality of Israel and the changing nature that we're going to see in that. And so we're going to see a lot of similarities between these three minor prophets, and then also Isaiah, who's going to kind of serve as the big summation of all of this, is really going to pick up on several of the images that we see there. And we definitely know that Isaiah has a lot to say about the Messiah and Messianic prophecies. So we're all kind of building in the next couple of weeks up to Isaiah, who's really going to flesh out the idea of this Messiah figure. So, well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate all the commentary and everything. Appreciate all of you who have joined us on Facebook Live. And we will continue this next week, Wednesday at 6 p.m. again. So thank you so much, and we will see you next time. All right, so that is the conclusion of Facebook Live, and that is the conclusion.